The stone won't fall until the podcast of the dragon comes to your device. Hey everybody, my name is Morgan. It's too confusing to keep being the Grey Warder on Twitter and Discord. Welcome to the 30th episode of Podcast of the Dragon. If Matt Cawthon was once an emo kid with a murder dagger, and he will be the son of battles, who is he in the Shadow Rising? How should he know he can't remember? Gambler, fuckboy, maker of rash and stupid decisions, today I dive deep on what this book puts him through and delight in what he does to himself. When it comes to the characters and their journeys throughout the Shadow Rising, no one exemplifies this running theme that RJ has of uncertainty, struggle, choice, and change more than Matt Cawthon. Over the course of the fourth book, he moves through each of these stages much more dramatically than any of the others, and I think that's probably because he is the only one of the Emmonsfield Five who has not accepted his fate, and this lack of acceptance leaves him uncertain what to do, struggling against the unseen forces that are denying him the ability to do what he wants to do. The frustration that he has from his uncertainty and his struggle brings him to make drastic and impulsive choices, and then those choices make his life change. They make his life and his very sense of self change. Before I go further, I'm going to give a quick summary of the time that we spend with Matt in this book. We come in on him in Chapter 2, where he is playing cards with the sons of Terran High Lords. We leave off Perrin's POV after the bubble of evil finishes attacking him, then jump back in time a little bit so that we can see its effect on Matt. RJ uses the device of a cock crowing to sync the time, having each of the boys remark upon it, either aloud in a conversation or in their internal narrative. So it's like cock-a-doodle-doo, it's time for something new in terms of creepy things trying to murder you. In Matt's case, it is a lethal winning hand, like the Red Queen and her minions decided to leap through the looking glass and deal him some death, which is super extra, but whatever. Matt runs to Tom for comfort and advice, and while the Gleeman can provide some of the former, the best of the other he has is ask someone else more qualified, Moraine, or maybe Nynaeve. Matt is not about to do either of those things, but does decide next day to see if Egwene has any helpful ideas, which debatably she does. He learns about the Redstone Doorway, but has no plans to use it until a confluence of unfortunate events, including the invasion of the stone by Trollocs and news of White Cloaks in the Two Rivers, makes him feel he has no choice. In the doorway, he learns he must go to Rhuidean, which coincidentally is where Rand happens to take them the next day after driving Kalendor into the heart of the stone. In Rhuidean, he goes through the second doorway while he's killing time, waiting for Rand to get out of the glass columns, and accidentally makes wishes while trying to ask more questions. He gets his artifacts and memories and hanged, and RJ uses the rest of his POVs to fill us in on his confusion and regret. I don't know, I guess you have to take responsibility for your actions to have regret. Anyway. And he uses his POVs to give us a different perspective on Rand's journey and to do world building with Aiel culture. The Emmonsfield Five, or maybe it's the Andarin Six at this point, we kind of have to include Elaine in our little group of heroes. They spend their 20 days in the Stone of Tyr before Chapter 2 opens, doing different things. The Channelers are occupied with various duties, whether it's Rand ruling and trying to unfuck this country that he's now in charge of, or it's the girls focusing on the Black Aja, interrogating Amiko Nagoyan and Joya Bayir, and trying to figure out whether they should go back to the White Tower or follow this clue, this fragment of conversation that Amiko claims to have overheard saying that there is something dangerous to Rand in Tanchico. Perrin has a girlfriend, so he is bursting with new relationship energy. He doesn't really have any kind of duty beyond the sense that he needs to stay close to Rand, but he is occupied. He is riding high on NRE, and while Book Perrin is too prudish to actually be fucking his brains out the whole time he's in the stone, he and Vail are getting to know each other, and he's having as good a time as Perrin can be having considering how serious he is, and how big the stakes are, and how concerning he finds everything. Since everybody else is occupied in their own way, whether because they have duties or because they're wrapped up in a new relationship, Matt is mostly left to his own devices. I think much of Matt's isolation is purposeful, not just from a plot perspective where it served RJ's intended arc to keep Matt away from the others. It makes sense for his character. He's less than 40 days out from being healed and having his memory scrubbed. He doesn't totally know who he is anymore. And I have to think that that leaves him in a really uncomfortable place as far as his position in the world and the way that he relates to the people who knew him or think that they did. The morning after he is attacked by the bubble of evil, he goes to see Egwene. He drops alongside her as she's walking along the hall, and it says, "This silence was not like him, not like the Matt she knew. Except for his fine red coat, wrinkled as if he had slept in it, he seemed no different than the old Matt, yet they were surely all different now. His quiet was unsettling. 'Is last night troubling you?' she asked at last. He missed a step. 'You know about that?' 'Well, you would, wouldn't you? Doesn't bother me. Wasn't much to it. Over and done with now anyway.' She pretended to believe him. 'Nynaeve and I do not see much of you.' That was a rank understatement. 'I've been busy,' he muttered, with an uncomfortable shrug, looking everywhere but at her again. 'Dicing?' she asked dismissively. 'Cards.' A plump maid, curtsying with her arms full of folded towels, glanced at Egwene, and apparently thinking she was not looking, winked at Matt. He grinned at her. 'I've been busy playing cards.' So Matt has been keeping himself occupied because he doesn't want to be near Rand. Perrin is busy, and his relationship with the girls is contentious. As this scene goes on, and Egwene is like, 'We don't see you very often,' he says, 'The last real interaction that we had, you tied me up with the one power and went through my room.' And she's like, 'First we asked you to give us back the Amerlins. What the bearer does is done under my authority paper.' And they have a little back and forth where he contends that they never said it was a loan, and it's just sort of, he was a dick, they were dicks, there's nothing but contention and dickishness between them. They behave with a sense of entitlement, he acts like a childish asshole, and everybody's a little bit wrong. If any one of them wrote into the Am I the Asshole thread on Reddit, they'd get an everybody sucks here judgment from me. Anyway. But he has a strange relationship with the girls, because they are judging and reacting to the person that they knew, and I'm sure that makes Matt feel really wrong-footed because he has all of these gaps in his memory, and so it's not just that many of the incidents that they might be judging him for he has no recollection of, but also that so much of the person they're judging is gone, and he's left floundering, not even knowing who it is that they think they know. Overall, Matt's time in the Stone has been relatively comfortable. He's been gaming, playing cards, playing stones with Tom. He's got more than one maid on dial, he's been having plenty of sex, and he goes out into the city as well to dice. All of his pastimes are pleasant. You almost wouldn't know that in his last POV in The Dragon Reborn, he's mentally preparing to leave. Moiraine tells him, hey, the Dark One is not dead, the last battle has not been fought, and you are Ta'Veren. You are a crucial thread in the pattern. You blew the horn of Valir. Nothing's done for you yet. And Matt is like, sure, totally, yeah. And he's wondering in his internal narrative how soon Tom will be fit to travel, and hey, maybe Perrin will come with us, and his actual thought is, time to run. And I don't know if Rance Ta'Veren's hooks immediately got into him, or if maybe he would have gotten away if he had left that night, but Tom was sick, and even if Moiraine had recovered enough from being zorched by a Shamael to heal him right away, any healing she did would have been of wounded soldiers. Tom needed Mother Gwenna's more conventional medicine to work, and who knows how many days it took for Tom to get better, but I'm assuming because he had a pretty bad cough, at least 2 or 3, and Matt does not want to travel alone, so he settled to wait until Tom got better. And while he's waiting for Tom to heal up, Matt gets wind of all of the young lordlings and their card games. He prefers to play dice, but dice don't make you nearly as much money as cards. And it is a stretch to say that Matt makes new friends because his old ones are all busy. But he begins spending time with young men whose fathers probably encouraged them to spend time with him. And I don't think they would have spent time with him originally, even with him being the Lord Dragon's friend, because he's sneering at all of the nobility, and in the beginning he's still in his peasant's clothes. He left Tarvalin in his country clothes. He gives you a rundown in his inner narrative when he first wakes up from being healed of the type of clothes that he has. It says he's got 2 coats and 2 pairs of pants and a handful of shirts and undies, and that all of his clothes are sturdy and well made but are country clothes. But Matt wants to make more money. And so he's like, I'm not going to get these fuckers to dice with me, but I can play cards. But they're not going to let me into their game unless I look the part. I've got to do something to make them take me seriously. So I'm guessing within a couple of days of being in the stone, he took some of the money that he had, because he had money that he won on his lucky night in Tarvalin, and from the ship captains that he earned money from when he was gambling on the river making his way down to Tyr, and then he's wandering around Tyr over those several days looking for the girls, and it says that his luck is even better because he's tossing coins to decide whether or not to go into random inns looking for them, and he goes in and wins all of the time, probably because the girls aren't in inns, so the toss of the coin is determining whether he'll have luck with the dice as he goes into the inns. So he's won a ton of money, and he's got enough to go and outfit himself with some nice new clothes that will make the lordlings actually see him. Because why not, when he saw how much more he could win? And it says, he had had the bright red coat made to an Andran pattern of the best wool, with golden embroidery scrolling around the cuffs and long collar. So no lace yet, and not silk, but fine wool is still something that some nobles wear. And according to my wife, who nerds out on this clothing historian and is really into natural fibers right now, like you never would believe someone would get so excited over getting socks for Christmas, but wool is actually cooler than silk. So Matt's got a really nice coat, well cut, well tailored, gold thread. He probably paid a fuck ton of money to get it made right away, and he's the Lord Dragon's friend. So these guys are like, okay, we'll do you into our poker game. And to them, he's not a peasant, because he's got the clothes, and he's got the money, and he is the Lord Dragon's friend. It is politically expedient that they welcome him. Their fathers likely urge them to do so, so they deal him in. And it passes the time for him. And I'm sure everybody knows how days just slip by. It's amazing how fast time can go by if you get into a comfortable routine. Matt's got people he bones down with. He's got games that he plays. He's got shit going on, and so the days keep passing. And when it comes to gambling, and I'm not a gambler, I've never really understood the appeal, but a lot of people do like it, and we hear later that Matt more than merely likes gambling. He loves it. The risk and the rush, and because it's not a risk for him, or not such a risk for him, because he has a lot more luck than the average person, it's probably a fuck ton of fun for him. And, if I had magical luck, I would probably enjoy it more too and get more of a thrill. So when it comes to gambling, and for people who really like it, how much is enough? It says, when he had enough to keep himself as he wanted, he would leave the stone just as quickly, before Moraine knew what he was thinking. He would have been days gone by now if he had had his way. It was just that there was gold to be had here. One night at this table could earn him more than a week of dicing in taverns, if only his luck would catch. So, it's like his luck isn't as good with cards as with dice, because they're not as random, but it's pretty good. He always wins more than he loses, but he still loses, and so he's telling himself that his luck isn't catching enough, even though there's totally no chance that he's not winning more than he would in the taverns. But Matt's ideas of luxury are shifting. It says later on that his thoughts of luxury have changed since he left the Two Rivers. And there's just this sense of, because there is so much to win here, because these young men are the sons of high lords, and therefore they're ridiculously wealthy. Tyr is a very wealthy nation, and the people who are not wealthy are oppressed and basically stolen from by the lords. Their taxes are oppressive. The gap between rich and poor is huge in Tyr, and so the men Matt is gambling with have fuck tons of money, and he is happy to take as much away from them as he can, because it's there for the taking, and it's like, why not? There's no urgency. He does want to go. He knows being here isn't great. He's within 100 yards of a man who can channel, and then you add in all of the extra baggage that comes with the Dragon Reborn. But even so, it's comfortable, and there's money to be won, and it's easy. Even if it isn't as easy as if he were dicing with them, there's so much of it. To have a sense of control, though, Matt tells himself that being in the stone is his choice. Because he's frightened. They're all afraid, but the others are just better at dealing with it. And in Matt's case, rather than addressing his fear or compartmentalizing it, he avoids it with humor and by telling himself that he's being stupid. As he's playing cards, their game it's called Chop, and it sounds like it's kind of a version of poker, except they have 5 suits instead of 4. But anyway, Matt gets dealt out a card, and it says, Matt lifted it carefully with a thumbnail and did not let himself so much as blink. The ruler of cups, a high lord of Tyr. The rulers in a deck varied according to the land where the cards were made, with the nation's own ruler always as ruler of cups, the highest suit. These cards were old. He had already seen new decks with Rand's face or something like it on the ruler of cups, complete with the dragon banner. Rand, the ruler of Tyr. That still seemed ludicrous enough to make him want to pinch himself. Rand was a shepherd, a good fellow to have fun with when he was not going all over serious and responsible. Rand the Dragon Reborn now. That told him he was a stone fool to be sitting there where Moiraine could put her hand on him whenever she wanted, waiting to see what Rand would do next. Maybe Tom Merrilin would go with him, or Perrin. Only Tom seemed to be settling into the stone as if he never meant to leave, and Perrin was not going anywhere unless Faile crooked a finger. Well, Matt was ready to travel alone if need be. Yet there was silver in the middle of the table, and gold in front of the lordlings, and if he was dealt the 5th ruler there was no hand in Chop could beat him. Not that he really needed it. Suddenly he could feel luck tickling his mind. Not tingling as it did with the dice, of course, but he was already certain no one was going to beat 4 rulers. The Terrans had been betting wildly all night, the price of 10 farms crossing the table on the quickest hands. So, Matt lacks self-awareness, which has always been a personality trait. And he lacks it even further now because so much of what was himself is gone. So he has even less self to be aware of, and that just leaves him floundering. Well, we can look at these few paragraphs and surmise that what's holding him here beyond the promise of money is the roots that he has in people. He's like, maybe Tom will go with him, or maybe Perrin will go. He doesn't want to go by himself. And it's saying he's prepared to go alone if need be, but there's money here. There's so much money. Truthfully, he just has very little incentive to go when he doesn't have a friend to travel with, even though in Matt logic he has 0 incentive to stay at all and all manner of reasons to leave. So he feels lost. Matt goes to talk to Tom after the bubble of evil ruins his card game, and Tom's like, you could go to Moiraine for advice because I don't have good advice. And Matt's like, fuck no, I told you I don't want to talk to Aes Sedai. And Tom's like, well, what about Nynaeve? She was your village wisdom. And Matt's like, fuck no. She wants me to settle down on a farm and find a nice wife. And Tom points out truthfully enough that is not a bad life. And Matt says, I want more than cows and sheep and tobacco for the rest of my life. Matt shook his head. All these holes in memory. Sometimes I think if I could just fill them in, I'd know. Burn me, I don't know what I'd know, but I know I want to know it. That's a twisty riddle, isn't it? So it seems like a lot of Matt being twisted up inside is anxiety because of everything he can't remember. And Matt feels like he'd be better able to understand things and make better decisions and just be in better control if he knew more. And, he's had almost a month now to chill in the stone. The mad dash is over where he had a sense of purpose. He had to get out of the tower. He was going to Camelin on a mission to deliver Elaine's letter, and then he was running for Tyr to protect the girls because they had an unknown enemy intent on killing them. All of that is over, and so now he's had a lot of time to think and be troubled and be like, hey, I genuinely don't want to be here anymore. I want to leave. What's stopping me? Because as much as he knows that that's what he wants to do, he's missing the real desire or urge to. What is stopping him is not physical barriers or people interceding. It's not like he has his shit packed and is making a concerted effort to leave, but forces are working against him. The obstacles in his way are much more indeterminate. And I think people who have mental illnesses have a unique capacity to understand where Matt is coming from, because so many of us know the difference between wanting to do something and wanting to want to do something. Because I feel like that is really where Matt's position is. He wants to take action. He wishes he had the motivation to leave because he feels like where he is at is not a good place to be. And, he wants to go, he wants to get there, but he just doesn't have that sense of motivation or agency, and he doesn't know why. And, if he were to go to a therapist in Randland who didn't know Matt Cawthon was Taviran and tied to the Dragon Reborn, they'd be like, Matt, you sound a little depressed, and you've got a lot going on right now. You got healed from a cursed murder dagger, you've had a lot of trauma, you're missing a whole bunch of your memories. Who wouldn't be depressed? Who wouldn't be anxious, Yeah, it's hard for you right now to even motivate yourself to do anything. You have things that you want to do, but it's hard to even know what those things are right now, and that's totally normal. And maybe it is part of that, because even though the pull of Taviran is the plot device that keeps Matt there, he's the one constantly finding reasons to stay. The same way that you find reasons to put off whatever tasks you have until the next day, and then the day after that. Or you waited so long to answer that text or open that mail that there's no point to doing it now. Or you really wanted to hang out with your friend and you would have had a good time if you did, but you canceled because it takes so many spoons to get to the rendezvous point that the knowledge you'd leave with more spoons than you spent isn't enough motivation. Or else you're grateful they canceled with you and you secretly hope they'll put off rescheduling. Matt has thoughts and reasons that make him decide to stay. And they're based on feelings, and a lot of those feelings sound like anxiety, and a major symptom of depression is avoidance, something Matt Cawthon is uniquely talented at. In a way, books 3, 4, and 5 are kind of an acceptance test for Matt, where it is his place in the pattern and the ensuing duty, responsibility, and work, things that Matt hates. He fucking hates those things, work especially. Those are the things that gain acceptance. Matt has to accept them, so it's like a reflection or inversion of the concept, because the women of the White Tower go through the arches to become accepted of the Tower, but in doing so they must accept the Tower as well. They must accept loss and pain and truths about themselves that they would rather not face in order to accept that they must want to be Aes Sedai more than anything. What Matt has to accept is his fate, and because of the person that he is, he has to be run through this multi-phase gauntlet in a manner that is spiritually similar to the arches they send novices through. There are even doorways involved. If we think of the Dragon Reborn as Matt's way back for what was, there he is washed clean of Matt Cawthon. The women go through the arches, they come out of each one and have ewers of water poured over them, and they're washed clean of false pride, they're washed clean of sins that they may have committed, and lastly, they're washed clean of the person that they were. In the Dragon Reborn, he is washed clean of Matt Cawthon. He loses the person that he was and has to be someone new. And in this book, Matt is facing what is, the way back for what is, and what isn't. And because he's frustrated with what is, and he's consumed by what isn't, and he's struggling in the dark because he isn't even sure what is and what isn't, he's going to make a lot of stupid and impulsive decisions. And those stupid impulsive decisions are going to set him on the path to his third trial, his third quote-unquote pass through the arches that will happen in the fires of heaven. In The Shadow Rising, we are introduced to a new go-to mechanic that RJ invented for spontaneous action and plot movement, which is the Bubble of Evil. We've had Trollocs be the, we need something to move the plot along, so Trollocs are going to attack device, and he does continue to use that, but they aren't very interesting if you just keep spamming them along like cartoon henchmen. Personally, I don't care for bubbles of evil, and I've never before critically considered why, in this book, the bubble of evil bothers me so much as a way to get our main plotline kicked off, because it is certainly very effective in forcing our characters to move and interact, it pushes and ignites conflict between them, and it allows RJ to fill in readers with organic conversations that don't seem so much like exposition, so he's able to catch us up and do some world building. It's actually very, very useful. But they're corny. They're corny, they're convenient, and they're contrived. And even within the canon and lore of the world, they don't make much fucking sense. Some of the things that happen with bubbles of evil throughout the course of the book seem much more quote-unquote realistic than the others. Like the first bubble of evil that we experience is when the wind catches Rand on the tower top at the beginning of the Great Hunt. It pushes him against Lon's practice sword, and the sword bends and snaps and cuts him. That is a bubble of evil that, within the way that RJ's world works, I can see as being realistic, because I can see matter and space and time being affected by a bubble of evil that might cause atoms to phase in a way where a wind would go solid. Something like Perrin's axe attacking him? Okay. I'm not a huge fan of it. Matt's playing cards are fucking ridiculous. It's so cheesy that I have a really hard time taking it seriously. It's just extra and fucking ludicrous. The doppelgangers that attack Rand is also really hard to imagine some way that the pattern would shift or phase unless it made a portal into other worlds and other Rands came through. Maybe that works. You could possibly talk me into that working. But there are future ones where they just don't make any sense, and Brandon Sanderson uses way too many of them, and while I get that they appear more and more often as we go along and as the last battle comes closer, at the same time you cannot overuse them as a plot device to take your channelers out or force your party to stay still or whatever. It's very convenient in Book 12 or Book 13 where Perrin's channelers are basically out of commission for a while because his Ashaman have been bitten by spontaneous venomous snakes, and so he's stuck on this road, and it's how he meets up with Galad. And I suppose you could make an argument that there's some kind of phasing of the pattern or folding that caused a pit of snakes to open up. I guess you could convince me of that, but that said, it's kind of lazy writing. But when it comes to the beginning of the Shadow Rising, I have not taken the time or the energy to think of how I would have achieved plot movement and character conflict with an economy of page time and minimal exposition and no need of anything to tie up. So maybe I should just shut my mouth about it because, it's pretty effective. Anyway, so Matt is attacked by the Bubble of Evil. He flees his ruined poker game after his encounter with the murderous Royal Flush, and the next time we see him is from Tom's POV. Matt goes to Tom for comfort and advice, which isn't something we've really seen him do. Matt is not the kind of person to ask for help. His brand of toxic masculinity, which I find much less tiresome than Rand's brand, and even less tiresome than Perrin's brand, is to make light of everything rather than deal with it. It's not a good way to process one's feelings, but I get it, and it just doesn't seem so toxic. But the Bubble of Evil is not something Matt can make light of, so he goes to Tom and tells him what happened and that he's been thinking of leaving Tyr. And Tom says, "You have been thinking of leaving Tyr since the day you walked into the stone." Perched on the edge of the stool, Matt shot him an angry look. "And I mean to. I do. Why not come with me, Tom? There are towns where they think the Dragon Reborn hasn't drawn a breath yet, where nobody's given a thought to the bloody prophecies of the bloody dragon in years, if ever. Places where they think the Dark One is a grandmother's tale, and Trollocs are travelers' wild stories, and Myrddraal rides shadows to scare children. You could play your harp and tell your stories, and I could find a game of dice. We could live like lords, traveling as we want, staying where we want, with no one trying to kill us." That hit too close for comfort. Well, he was a fool, and there it was. He just had to make the best of it. "If you really mean to go, why haven't you?" "Maureen watches me," Matt said bitterly, "and when she isn't, she has somebody else doing it." "I know. I said I don't like to let someone go once they lay hands on them." It was more than that, he was sure. More than what was openly known, certainly, but Matt denied any such thing, and no one else who knew was talking either, if anyone besides Moraine did know. It hardly mattered. He liked Matt, he even owed him in a fashion, but Matt and his troubles were a street-corner rah-ree compared to Rand. "But I cannot believe she really has someone watching you all the time. As good as. She's always asking people where I am, what I'm doing. It gets back to me. Do you know anybody who won't tell an Aes Sedai what she wants to know? I don't. As good as being watched. You could avoid eyes if you put your mind to it. I've never seen anyone as good at sneaking about as you. I mean that as a compliment." "Something always comes up," Matt muttered. "There's so much gold to be had here, and there's a big-eyed girl in the kitchens who likes a little kiss and tickle, and one of the maids has hair like silk to her waist and the roundest." He trailed off as if he had suddenly realized how foolish he sounded. "Have you considered that maybe it's because if you mention ta'veren, Tom, I'm leaving?" Tom changed what he had been going to say. "That maybe it's because Rand is your friend and you don't want to desert him." "Desert him?" The boy jumped up, kicking over the stool. "Tom, he's the bloody Dragon Reborn. At least that's what he and Moraine say. Maybe he is. He can channel and he has that bloody sword that looks like glass. Prophecies. I don't know, but I know I would have to be as crazy as these Terrans to stay." He paused. You don't think Moraine is keeping me here, do you? With the power?" "I do not believe she can," Tom said slowly. He knew a good bit about Aes Sedai, enough to have some idea how much he did not know, and he thought he was right on this. Matt raked his fingers through his hair. "Tom, I think about leaving all the time, but I get these strange feelings, almost as if something was going to happen, something momentous, that's the word. It's like knowing there will be fireworks for Sunday, only I don't know what it is I'm expecting. Whenever I think too much about leaving, it happens, and suddenly I've found some reason to stay another day. Always just one more bloody day. Doesn't that sound like Aes Sedai work to you?" So Tom is thinking to himself, actually the reason that Matt is stuck here is ta'veren, but Matt doesn't want to talk about that. And he doesn't want to think about that, because at least if he can tell himself that he's being stupid for staying here and that his choices are dumb, or if he could tell himself that it's Moiraine's fault, then it's not impossible to overcome. So a little further on it says, I am leaving, as soon as I can fetch my things and find a horse, not a minute longer. In the middle of the night? The morning will do. He refrained from adding, if you really do leave. Sit down, relax, we'll play a game of stones. I have a jar of wine here somewhere. Matt hesitated, glancing at the door. Finally he jerked his coat straight. The morning will do. He sounded uncertain, but he picked up the overturned stool and set it beside the table. But no wine for me, he added as he sat down. Strange enough things happen when my head is clear. I want to know the difference. Tom was thoughtful as he put the board and the bags of stones on the table. Just that easily the lad was diverted. Pulled along by an even stronger Tavira named Randall Thor was how Tom saw it. So, as Matt's being like, hey, do you think Moiraine's keeping me here? It feels like something momentous is going to happen. And Tom's like, normally I wouldn't suggest this, but I said I know a lot of shit. And Matt's like, fuck no, I want to get away from Aes Sedai. And then Tom's like, well, 90 was your village wisdom. And Matt's like, are you kidding me? But he thinks about it, and he's finally like, well, I'll go see Egwene instead. She's the next best thing. And Egwene and Matt actually have a lot in common. Theirs is a relationship I wish RJ had invested more time in developing, and I actually have a mini-sode on my Patreon that does a little exploration of their relationship through this short scene where he goes to ask Egwene for advice, because it is one of those relationships among the Emmons Fielders that RJ just doesn't have time to develop. If he took the time to develop a relationship between two people for each of the Emmons Fielders, he would have to do 10 of them, and that's just for the 5 of them. So he had to focus on the ones that were significant for the plot, and the relationship between Egwene and Matt just isn't. But RJ does a good job in a relatively small amount of text of showing who they are with each other. And so I did a little mini-sode on that because I just have to admire what he can do with minimal text, as I have gone on and on about before. But Egwene and Matt are the two Emmons Fielders who are actually happy that their lives have changed. Matt is in a state of crisis. Both of them have suffered terrible trauma. At the moment, Matt hates that he doesn't know what to do. He's struggling with these missing memories. He's really in a miserable place. But even with that, even with just being lost in the stone, for him, it's better than what he'd be dealing with in the Two Rivers. Because after Egwene says, I can't really help you, but let me tell you about this ter'angreal because it's literally the only thing I know that might be able to help you, and how convenient for plot purposes that Moiraine told me about it, even though she never tells anybody anything. But it says, Egwene, do you ever wish you were back home, that none of this had ever happened? It was a startling question coming from him, but she knew her answer. No, even with everything, no. Do you? I would be a fool then, wouldn't I? He laughed. It's cities I like, and this one will do for now. This one will do. So, whatever Matt says, and however much he complains, and however much he is in a state of existential crisis right now, he's much more happy than not, and he's just not about to admit it, because Matt never admits it, because why would he? And that's what makes Matt fun to read. Matt's internal melodrama is just so endlessly entertaining for me. Earlier, when he's still playing cards, before he has his unfortunate encounter with the murderous royal flush, just before, he has a burst of old tongue that comes out of his mouth, and the lordlings call him out on it. It says, goosebumps pebbled Matt's skin as he tried to recall the words that had just come out of his mouth. A string of gibberish, yet it almost seemed he should understand. Burn Moiraine. If she'd left me alone, I wouldn't have holes in my memory big enough for a wagon and team, and I wouldn't be spouting whatever blood he is. He would also be milking his father's cows instead of walking the world with a pocket full of gold, but he managed to ignore that part of it. So he's mostly happy, but anything that he really struggles with, he either wants to blame Moiraine for because she is the driving force of his life change and nothing is ever his fault. Nothing is ever his fault or his responsibility. And while it would be more appropriate to be burn the Dark One, and if Moiraine were not such a controlling factor in his life, he might be more likely to do that, but because she is pushy and controlling and Aes Sedai, he's going to blame her. But despite all of that, Matt is mostly happy. But he's also anxious, and anxiety is hard to deal with, especially this particular flavor. Worry of the unknown, trying to just pierce this fog that's surrounding him. It's exasperating, the mystery of it. It's just illogical because nothing before has ever been able to hold him, and so he has to blame something. It's got to be Moiraine. It's got to be the holes in his memory. It's anything but the pattern, because if it's the pattern, that can't be escaped. Those other things have potential solutions, but if it's the pattern and it's being Ta'Viren, there's no way out of that, and he cannot accept that. So he goes to Egwene for help, and it says, "I'm trying to decide what to do." He looked embarrassed. He had a right to, in her opinion. "I hope you are not thinking of trying to leave. You know how important you are. You cannot run away from it, Matt." "You think I don't know that? I don't think I could leave if Moiraine told me I could. Believe me, Egwene, I am not going anywhere. I just want to know what's going to happen." He gave a rough shake of his head and his voice grew tighter. "What comes next? What's in these holes in my memory? There are chunks of my life that aren't even there. They don't exist, as if they never happened. Why do I find myself spouting gibberish? People say it's the old tongue, but it's goose gabble to me. I want to know, Egwene. I have to know before I go as crazy as Rand." So Egwene is used as a device to pass on the information about the doorway. And if we give Robert Jordan credit that Moraine's character has progressed enough in a stage of desperation and frustration that she would believably have told the girls about the ter'angreal, and that she might feel pressed to actually go through it and also give them the information on how to properly use it, which I'm still wavering on whether or not that's a mischaracterization. But at the point that she would do that, I think that Egwene, in having this information, it's totally believable she would pass it on to Matt, even though she does not trust Matt to be cautious, because she's a fairly incautious person in her own way. It's believable because she has a sense of feeling entitled to information, whether or not it's dangerous, because people have the right to decide for themselves what manner of danger they want to be in. Egwene has her own blind spots when it comes to self-awareness, and Egwene is someone who kind of bowls into wanting to know everything, because of her insatiable curiosity, which is sometimes destructive. I love Egwene, I love her character, I love her character arc, but she goes through a period of a handful of books where even as her development is kind of great, she's also fairly obnoxious. And part of that is just that she's in a situation where if she's not kept occupied, she's potentially destructive. Not out of a desire to bring ruin, but because her curiosity and her need to get into shit is potentially dangerous. Egwene is like a Siberian husky. Super awesome, but you had better by God keep her stimulated. Or the best case scenario, she's going to annoy the shit out of everyone and get into everything, and she has the potential to cause harm, even with the best intentions. So, she tells Matt about the door-frame ter'angreal, and he's not particularly glad of the news. In the beginning, he does not consider her news helpful. She tells him about it, tells him the dangers and the rules, and then it's like, you can't use it unless Moiraine tells you, and it says, he gave a loud snort. "I'd be a fool if I did try it, no matter what Moiraine says. Walk into a bloody ter'angreal? It's less I want to do with the bloody power, not more. You can blot it right out of your mind." "It is the only chance I know, Matt." "Not for me, it isn't," he said firmly. "No chance at all is better than that." Despite his tone, she wanted to put an arm around him, only he would likely make some joke at her expense and try to goose her. He had been incorrigible from the day he was born, but he had come to her for help. "I'm sorry, Matt. What will you do?" "Oh, play cards, I suppose, if anyone will play with me. Play stones with Tom, dice in the taverns. I can still go as far as the city, at least." His gaze strayed toward a passing maidservant, a slender, dark-eyed girl near his own age. "I'll find something to take up the time." So, would Matt have gone through the doorway had the Trollocs not attacked? Or is it enough that after the bubble of evil, Matt's time in the stone just isn't as much fun? It says during Matt's little section of what I call those relay race paragraphs at the beginning of Chapter 9, the chapter called Decisions, Matt quickly discovered that he had been right about the young lords who saw the playing cards try to kill him. Not only did they avoid him, they spread the word among their friends, often garbled. No one in the stone who had 2 pieces of silver in hand would say more than hasty excuses while backing away. The rumors spread beyond the lordlings. More than one serving woman who had enjoyed a cuddle now declined too, and 2 said uneasily that they had heard it was dangerous to be alone with him. Perrin appeared all wrapped up in his own worries, and Tom seemed to vanish by sleight of hand. Matt had no idea what occupied the Gleeman, but he was seldom to be found, day or night. Moiraine, the one person Matt wished would ignore him, instead seemed to be there whenever he turned around. She was just passing by or crossing the corridor in the distance, but her eyes met his every last time, looking as if she knew what he was thinking and what he wanted, knew how she was going to make him do exactly what she wanted instead. None of it made any difference in one respect. He still managed to find excuses to put off leaving for another day. As he saw it, he had not promised Egwene he would stay, but he did. Once he carried a lamp down into the belly of the stone to the so-called Great Holding, as far as the dry-rotted door at the far end of the narrow hallway. A few minutes of peering into the shadowy interior at dim shapes covered with dusty canvas, roughly stacked crates and barrels, their flat ends used as shelves for jumbles of figurines and carvings and peculiar things of crystal and glass and metal. A few minutes of that and he hurried away, muttering, "I'd have to be the biggest bloody fool in the whole bloody world." So, Matt is no longer enjoying the sex and high-stakes gambling that made the days slip by in the Stone of Tyr and made the fact that he was stuck being close to Rand so easy to ignore. Even if he was troubled by it, thinking about it and troubled by it, it just didn't seem such a huge deal, because there was gold to be had here. There were hot women that were willing to bang him, but now neither of those things is the case. He can go into the city and go dicing, but it's not the same. The money isn't as good. And so maybe Matt is the sort where his curiosity would have gotten the better of him, and he would eventually have kept going back down into the Great Holding and finally not have been able to help himself but go into the doorway. But I don't think so. Not with an object of the power. With any number of other things, yes, but not an object of the power. The pattern had to pile on extra doubt to get him to go. Conflict and indecision put him in a position where he felt like going through the doorway was 100% necessary and there was no other way, because otherwise he loathed the power so much that no amount of curiosity would have caused him to go through the ter'angreal. It's not cutting open a firework or exploring a creepy city or any number of other things that are dangerous and foolish but perfectly capable of being understood. The next POV that we get from Matt post the relay race paragraphs at the beginning of Chapter 9 is in Chapter 13. This is after the Trolloc attack. We know it's really late at night because when the Trollocs first invade the stone, it's just after sundown, and because it's like the height of summer, it's late. It's not quite to the solstice, and we know that because if you look in the Wheel of Time Companion, it specifies that the great big Trolloc attack on Emond's Field that happens at the end of the book is on Sunday, which is the longest day of the summer. Basically, what for those of us in the Northern Hemisphere is about June 21st. So this has to be a couple of weeks before that, what would probably be the beginning of June for us. But obviously, especially in a southern area like Tyr, the sun is going to be going down very late at night. Probably not quite as late on their clocks as I'm thinking of, because I don't think they do daylight savings time in Randland, but who knows how long the attack goes on for, and post-attack, Matt is in a tavern, and it's late, and it says, dipping a finger in his wine, he sketched aimlessly on the tabletop. These fools had no idea what had happened in the stone tonight. He had heard a few Terrans mention some kind of trouble, quick words that trailed off into nervous laughter. They did not know and did not want to. He almost wished he did not know himself. No, he wished he had a better idea of what had happened. The images kept flashing in his head, flashing through the holes in his memory, making no real sense. The din of fighting somewhere in the distance echoed down the corridor, dulled by the wall hangings. He retrieved his knife from the grey man's corpse with a shaking hand. A grey man, and hunting him. It had to have been after him. Grey men did not wander about, killing at random. They had targets as surely as an arrow. So, Matt's there, obviously fucked up about everything. He's also upset because he was going to die. He was facing a Myrddraal who specifically called him out for being the person who sounded the horn of Valir, and all he's got is his knives. He throws a knife at the Fade and it knocks it out of the air, and then a group of Trollocs dogpile on the Fade and kill it, and Matt is able to get away because they don't go after him. At some point, we learn that the original Trolloc attack is sent by Samael, and for a long time we don't know who sends the Trollocs who rescue Matt, and they also rescue Rand. And Rand asks Lanfear, she comes upon him while the attack is going on and taunts him because he's using his fire sword to fight the Trollocs, and she's like, you've left Calendar up there where anybody can get it, dumbass. And he asks her, hey, are you responsible for these Trollocs that just saved my life? She hesitates and then chooses not to take credit because she says, if I take credit, you'll expect it. I don't know if RJ was leaving that ambiguous because Lanfear didn't do it and wanted to pretend that she had, or if he had not decided yet who had actually sent the second band, but regardless, we learn in Book 6 that it was Semirhage. The point is, while Matt is sitting there brooding about being attacked by grey men and called out by Myrddraal and rescued by Trollocs, he hears about the White Cloaks in the Two Rivers. He overhears a table talking about the Two Rivers, and he gets up, and it's like, I heard Two Rivers. And the guy's like, yeah, I was just saying there's not going to be any tobacco out of there because of the white cloaks. And so Matt runs back to the Stone of Tyr, goes to Perrin's room, and finds that Perrin is packing. And Matt is in this weird position because he's kind of fucked up about all of this. You know, he does not want to be in the stone, or at least he wants to leave. And especially now he wants to leave because there is nothing to make him want to stay here. A whole bunch of really bad shit just happened. Everything's scary and awful. Nobody wants to fuck him. Nobody wants to play cards with him. Shadowspawn have attacked. It's just not a great scene. And now he's found out that there are white cloaks in his home, specifically looking for a dark friend with yellow eyes and the dragon reborn. No mention of him, but what's the coincidence? And it's like he wants to go home because he should want to go home. Of course you should want to go home and help your people. And so now he is in a situation of bad enough not to want to leave, but what the fuck is wrong with you that you don't want to go home and help your people? And he's thinking things like, if he went home, he had the feeling he would never leave again, that his mother would marry him off before he could sit down. But if he did not go, if the white cloaks harmed them, all it took was a rumor for white cloaks, so he had heard. But why should there be any rumor about them? Even the Coplans, liars and troublemakers to a man, liked his father. Everybody liked Abel Cawthon. And Perrin tells him, hey, I didn't hear anything about you, just about Rand and me. You don't have to go. And Matt's just kind of like, I do want to, meaning I do want to. And Matt asks him, don't you feel something? Don't you feel something telling you have to stay? You know, how the fuck are you able to pack your shit to go? And Perrin's like, yeah, I feel things telling me I want to stay. All of this stuff is pulling me, but I have logicked my way out of it. There are 100 things tying me, telling me I need to stay here. You know, the next day when Rand sticks the sword into the heart of the stone, Perrin feels like he's being sucked by a whirlpool, and he has to get on his horse and gallop to get away because Ta'Viren tries so hard to hold him there. But he's like, I've logicked my way out of it. I have accepted that I am tied to the pattern. I know that I'm Ta'Viren, and that Rand's and my fate are tied together, and because I have accepted all of this, I can logic my way out of it and know, oh, the reason that I'm wanting to stay here and that I'm struggling to find the motivation to leave is because I'm Ta'Viren, Rand's Ta'Viren, we're being magnetically pulled together as Ta'Viren, and so he can mentally work his way past that and fight through it, because Perrin has a logic brain, and long ago reached acceptance. But as Perrin goes on, Matt's like, burn me, Perrin, burn me. I want to... See, I can't even say it now, like my head knows I'll do it if I say it. I can't even get it out in my mind. Different paths. We've been sent down different paths before. Different paths be bloodied, Matt grunted. I've had all I want of Rand and Aes Sedai shoving me down their bloody paths. I want to go where I want for a change. Do what I want. And he leaves Perrin to go. And... you know, Matt feels really shitty because he's just sort of like, I can't even speak the words to go. I want to go. I should be able to. Perrin's able to do this. Why can't I? Especially because he has zero incentive to remain in the stone at this point, and he feels really bad. And so he has now become desperate enough to seek answers. And Matt would prefer to ask otherworldly demon creatures for advice rather than Aes Sedai, which makes sense because the Aelfin have no motive or stake beyond feeding off Matt's emotions and sensations. An Aes Sedai will absolutely have a motive, and so any answers that an Aes Sedai gives Matt are going to be loaded. One of the reasons I think that it took these particular events, the Trolloc attack and then hearing about the White Cloaks in the Two Rivers and not being able to motivate himself to leave even with a fundamental threat to his home, and I'm wondering if he had actually heard thereafter Matt Cawthon too, if that might have been enough. But he doesn't hear it. There's that seed of doubt, and so he is still held. But one of the reasons that I think pure curiosity would never have been enough to get Matt to go is just because of the language RJ uses at the beginning of the chapter called Into the Doorway. There is so much hesitation and dread in it. It says, holding the glass-mantled lamp high, Matt peered down the narrow corridor deep in the belly of the stone. Not unless my life depended on it. That's what I promised. Well, burn me if it doesn't. Before doubt could seize him again, he hurried on, past doors dry-rotted and hanging aslant, past others only shreds of wood clinging to rusted hinges. The floor had been swept recently, but the air still smelled of old dust and mold. Something skittered in the darkness, and he had a knife out before he realized it was just a rat running from him, no doubt running towards some escape hole it knew. Show me the way out, he whispered after it, and I'll come with you. Why am I whispering? There's nobody down here to hear me. It seemed like a place for quiet, though. He could feel the whole weight of the stone over his head pressing down. And so he makes his way into the great big room that has all of this stuff, and he thinks a whole bunch of sexist thoughts about women making men work. That's one of the things that really frustrates me about Matt's character, is he's a lot more openly misogynistic than some of the others, and it's like, be better, Matt. Anyway, it says, what he sought stood out among the jumble, a tall red stone door frame looming oddly in the shadows cast by his lamp. When he came closer, it still looked odd, twisted somehow. His eye did not want to follow it around. The corners did not join right. The tall, hollow rectangle seemed likely to fall over at a breath, but when he gave it an experimental push, it stood steady. He pushed a bit harder, not sure he did not want to heave the thing over, and that side of it scraped through the dust. Goosebumps ran down his arms. There might as well have been a wire fastened to the top, suspending it from the ceiling. He held the lamp up to see. There was no wire. At least it won't topple while I'm inside. Light, I am going inside, aren't I? A clutter of figurines and small things wrapped in rotting cloth occupied the top of a tall, upended barrel near him. He pushed the jumble to one side so he could set the lamp there and study the doorway, the ter'angreal. If Egwene knew what she was talking about. She probably did. No doubt she had learned all sorts of strange things in the tower, however much she denied. She would deny things, wouldn't she now? Learning to be Aes Sedai. She didn't deny this, though, now did she? If he squinted, it looked just like a stone door frame, dully polished and the duller for dust. Just a plain door frame. Well, not entirely plain. 3 sinuous lines carved deep in the stone ran down each upright from top to bottom. He had seen fancier on farmhouses. He would probably step through and find himself still in this dusty room. Won't know till I try, will I? Luck. Taking a deep breath and coughing from the dust, he put his foot through. He seemed to be stepping through a sheet of brilliant white light. Infinitely bright, infinitely thick. For a moment that lasted forever, he was blind. A roaring filled his ears, all the sounds of the world gathered together at once, for just the length of one measureless step. Stumbling another pace, he stared around in amazement. The ter'angreal was still there, but this was certainly not where he had started. The twisted stone doorframe stood in the center of a round hall with a ceiling so high it was lost in shadows, surrounded by strange spiraled yellow columns snaking up into the gloom, like huge vines twining round poles that had been taken away. A soft light came from glowing spheres atop coiled stands of some white metal. Not silver, the shine was too dull for that, and no hint of what made the glow. It did not look like flame, the spheres simply shone. The floor tiles spiraled out in white and yellow stripes from the ter'angreal. There was a heavy scent in the air, sharp and dry, and not particularly pleasant. He almost turned around and went back on the spot. When I was probably around 10, I picked up and handled a garter snake that was sunning itself on the sidewalk, and at some point before I could wash my hands, made the mistake of accidentally putting them near my face. And it's a really not pleasant smell, and I've never forgotten it, so much so that whenever I've handled snakes since, I've always been especially mindful to make sure my hands get nowhere near my face until I can wash them. That's what I've always imagined Matt smells when he goes in through the doorway, and it would also make me instinctively want to just turn around and leave right there. So, I find the language of this incredibly evocative. Matt does not want to be here. This is not something that he wants to do. He's not looking forward to this, but at this point he feels like he has no choice. It's like he feels like he has no agency. He is paralyzed, and I know what that sense of paralysis feels like for me, from depression or from anxiety, as opposed to being a ta'veren tied to another ta'veren, and then having the ensuing anxiety of holes in my memory and a sense of powerlessness that accompanies that. But I'm too fearful of the unknown to ever be willing to go through a doorway, even if I felt like it would give me answers or an idea of what I could do to unfuck my life or unfuck my situation, because I've never felt quite that desperate or that curious, and I'm just way too fearful of the unknown. I could not do that. But Matt feels like this is the only agency that he has here. This is the one choice he's been able to make. And Matt feels guilty and conflicted because it felt so effortlessly right to not go home, and he wants to be free of this. He does not want to accept. He figures if he has his memories, then he'll have the tools that he needs to be able to get a handle on what's going on with his life. He'll have the bits of his mind that he needs to be able to figure this problem out. And if he can get away from Aes Sedai, because it's their fault that this is happening to him, it's their fault that he has no agency. It's because of the holes in his memory. They keep him from seeing the bigger picture so that he can't figure out the way to attack this problem that he has. It's all of these other things, but it is not being ta'veren, and it's not being tied to the pattern. His is a problem that he can figure out how to run away from. He just doesn't have the tools he needs for it yet. So it says, carefully, careful to say nothing that even sounded like a question, he laid the situation before them. The White Cloaks, certainly in his home village, surely hunting friends of his, maybe hunting him. One of his friends going to face the White Cloaks, another not. His family, not likely in danger, but with the bloody children of the Bloody Light around, a Taviran pulling at him so he could hardly move. He saw no reason to give names or mention that Rand was the Dragon Reborn. His first question, and the other two for that matter, he had worked out before going down to the Great Hold. "Should I go home to help my people?" he asked finally. 3 sets of slitted eyes lifted from him, reluctantly it seemed, and studied the air above his head. Finally the woman on the left said, "You must go to Rhuidean." As soon as she spoke, their eyes all dropped to him again, and they leaned forward, breathing deeply. But at that moment a bell tolled, a sonorous brazen sound that rolled through the room. They swayed upright, staring at one another, then at the air over Matt's head again. "He is another," the woman on the left whispered. The strain, the savor," the man said. "It has been long." "There is time yet," the other woman told them. She sounded calm. They all did, but there was a sharpness to her voice when she turned back to Matt. "Ask! Ask!" Matt glared up at them furiously. "Rhuidean! Light!" That was somewhere out in the waste. The light in the Aiel knew where. That was about as much as he knew. In the waste. Anger drove questions about how to get away from Aes Sedai and how to recover the lost parts of his memory right out of his head. "Rhuidean!" he barked. "The light burn my bones to ash if I want to go to Rhuidean, and my blood on the ground if I will. Why should I? You were not answering my questions. You were supposed to answer, not hand me riddles." "If you do not go to Rhuidean," the woman on the right said, "you will die." So, why is it a riddle? Because he didn't get the answer he was looking for? Why is Matt so upset? He's really amped up and anxious, and he asks a question, and he's asking a yes or no question. It's like, should I go home to help my people? And he's expecting, yes, you should go home to help your people, or no, you should not go home to help your people. And so he doesn't get the answer he wants, or the answer that he's expecting, which is yes or no. And so he kind of flips out. And my best guess is that he went in there with some kind of vague and desperate hope to be told that he did not have to go home, and then told, here's the way you keep out of Aes Sedai hands, and here's some way that you can manage to get your memory back. He does not want to be here. This whole experience is creepy, it's deeply unnerving, he's seriously afraid, and he would never have done this if he weren't hoping for a big reward. He's calculating on a positive return for this incredibly unpleasant experience, and getting the answer, go to Rhuidean, instead of, yes, you should go home to help your people, or no, you shouldn't, totally derails him. So, there are 3 people in the ter'angreal at the same time. This bell starts tolling while they're answering Matt's question, which tells us that Rand is the last person into the doorway. I think Matt must have gone in second, partly because of the way that the Aelfin greets him. He does it in a way that indicates Matt's not the first. Instead of being like, it's been a long time, but a seeker comes again, he says, the seekers come once more, indicating that Matt is not the first seeker to have come, so Moiraine must have gone in first. She does leave last, but I think that's probably just because she's not a Taviran and there's no real urgency to get her out. They need to get the boys the fuck out now. Also, she would have noticed Matt's lantern sitting on the upended barrel and been like, what the fuck? So she had to have gone in first. I don't know why Rand didn't think anything about why is there a fucking lantern here. It looks like there are people in the ter'angreal already. Maybe he didn't give a shit? Or maybe he got distracted by the jumble of objects that his buddy pushed aside to make room for the lantern, because I'm pretty sure Matt randomly knocked into prominence a certain fat little man that probably caught Rand's attention. Anyway, the snakes want to let Matt continue to ask his questions, because when Rand comes in, the gong sounds, and one snake is like, he's another, there's too much strain, and the others are like, oh no, this is fucking great. They're already crossfaded on the emotions and experiences of a channeler and a Taviran, and then Rand, a combo of each, pops in to add the dragon's high to their trip, and so they're like, oh, this is fucking off the hook, while at the same time, they are very aware of the danger, and so they need to get him out. They've given him his 3 answers, because he asks why he'll die if he goes to Rhuidean, and they say, you'll have sidestepped the threat of fate and left your fate to drift on the winds of time. And so, as he's pushing for a 4th question, what fate? Fighting them off, refusing to leave, and demanding, what fate? What fucking fate? And so because the ceiling is falling down, they answer a fourth question. He's the only person who ever gets a fourth question answered, and they tell him, you're going to marry the daughter of the 9 moons. You're going to give up half the light of the world to save the world. You're going to die and live again. And then they fling him out of the Tarankrial. And he leaves it with even more questions than he entered, because he feels like they answered him with riddles. And he is much more occupied with those than he is with his original questions, because when he goes through the second doorway and goes to ask questions of the foxes, he does not ask them, how do I get away from Aes Sedai? How do I get my memories back? He asks for answers to the questions raised because he didn't get a yes or no answer to, should I go home and help my people? So it says, speak, one of the women said in that growling voice. By the ancient treaty, here is agreement made. What is your need? Speak. Matt hesitated. That was not what the snaky people had said. They were all staring at him like foxes staring at dinner. Who is the daughter of the 9 moons, and why do I have to marry her? He hoped they would count that as one question. No one answered. None of them spoke. They just continued to stare at him with those big pale eyes. You were supposed to answer, he said. Silence. Burn your bones to ash. Answer me. Who is the daughter of the 9 moons, and why do I have to marry her? How will I die and live again? What does it mean that I have to give up half the light of the world? Those are my 3 questions. Say something. Dead silence. He could hear himself breathing, hear the blood throbbing in his ears. So, Matt is anxious, and it's like the lands of the Eelfin are far more alarming to him than the lands of the Aelfin. The foxes are a lot creepier than the snakes, with their harnesses of human skin. It's not a great scene, and so he's agitated. They're not answering questions because that's not what they do, but he doesn't realize that, so he starts getting upset and running at the mouth again as he does in the first doorway that he goes through, and so he's continuing on. I have no intention of marrying, and I have no intention of dying either, whether I am supposed to live again or not. I walk around with holes in my memory, holes in my life, and you stare at me like idiots. If I had my way, I'd want those holes filled, but at least answers to my questions might fill some in my future. You have to answer. Done, one of the men growled, and Matt blinked. Done? What was done? What did he mean? Burn your eyes, he muttered. Burn your souls. You are as bad as Aes Sedai. Well, I want a way to be free of Aes Sedai and the power, and I want to be away from you and back to Rhuidean if you will not answer me. Open up a door and let me... Done, another man said, and one of the women echoed, done. So in a roundabout way, Matt got his questions answered. The Finn just skipped telling him how to get his memories back and how to get away from Aes Sedai and got straight to here. So when the snakes tell Matt to go to Rhuidean, and it is not what he wants to hear, first he dismisses them as liars to Rand. Matt has tried to jump back into the doorway because they throw him out as he's screaming at them, what fate, what bloody fate, no I'm not fucking leaving, explain this to me. So they throw him out, he tries to go back in, and he just goes through the other side because you can only go in once, and Rand comes out. It says, he gave a start when he saw Matt. Just poking around, Matt? Or did you go through too? Matt eyed him warily. At least that sword was gone. He did not seem to be channeling, though how was anybody to tell? And he did not look particularly like a madman. In fact, he looked very much as Matt remembered. He had to remind himself they were not back home any longer, and Rand was not what he remembered. Oh, I went through all right. A bunch of bloody liars, if you ask me. What are they? Made me think of snakes. Not liars, I think. Rand sounded as if he wished they were. No, not that. They were afraid of me, right from the first, and when that tolling started, the sword kept them back. They wouldn't even look at it, shied away, hid their eyes. Did you get your answers? Nothing that makes sense, Matt muttered. What about you? So, Matt leaves the Great Holding, and he's like, what am I gonna do? Rhuidean, what the fuck? That was not what he was expecting when he went in there. He went in there expecting straightforward answers to an actual fate that he was trying to direct. He wanted a yes or no about going home. And then it was sort of like, yeah, I'm going to get my memories back. I'm going to find a way to get away from Aes Sedai. I have this direction that I'm planning on going. And so getting slapped with Rhuidean was just like, what the fuck? And so he's not sure what to do about it. So he just decides to stay with Rand because that feels right. That's what he's been doing all along. He's still stuck in his inertia, so he goes with it. Only now he's also stressing about all of this extra information that he's just been given. And he does not know the destination that Rand has selected until they leave the stone. Rand doesn't tell Moraine we're going to Rhuidean until after he drives Kalendor into the heart. This whole beginning arc of Matt's in the Shadow Rising is a testament to someone complaining that he has no agency. But actually, he made a number of choices. He went and talked to Egwene. He ran to Tom for advice on instinct because people in the Two Rivers discussed their problems along gendered lines, and when Tom proposed some people who might be better solutions or have better advice, Matt went with the spirit of the suggestion but made his own choice. He asked a certain person, not someone Tom suggested, and that person gave him another option of the doorway. And then he made the decision to go through the doorway. And then he gets to the point where, as they're making their way toward the portal stone, he chooses to help Rand. Matt is actually taking actions, almost in the manner of submitting to and aiding fate. From Rand's point of view, as they're riding out of the stone, it says, Matt's face was a study, doubt and reluctance and grim determination all running across it by turns, especially when he glanced at Moraine. He never looked at her directly, only from the edge of his eye. "Are you sure you want to come, Matt?" Rand asked. Matt shrugged and affected a grin, not a very confident one. Who could pass up the chance to see bloody Rhoydian? Egwene raised her eyebrows at him. "Oh, pardon my language, Aes Sedai. I've heard you say is bad, and for less cause, I'll wager." Egwene stared at him indignantly, but spots of color in her cheeks said he had scored a hit. "Be glad Matt is here," Moraine said to Rand, her voice cool and not pleased. "You made a grave error letting Perrin run off, hiding his going from me. The world rests on your shoulders, but they must both support you or you will fall, and the world with you." Matt flinched, and Rand thought he very nearly turned his gelding and rode away on the spot. So Matt's not super thrilled about going to Rhoydian, and I almost think he was just kind of like, okay, I'm going with Rand because this is what I've been doing all along. We're leaving, and then he hears they're going to Rhoydian, and all of a sudden it feels like shit's gotten real. He was not expecting that was going to be their destination when Rand drove the sword into the stone, and so I can imagine him just kind of feeling swept up in his fate. And it's like, what fate? What fate? Oh, this is the fate, and even though he's finally learning what's going to happen, now he almost wishes that he wouldn't. But he's still helping. He is far less enthused about the journey when he learns that, oh, we're actually going to go there by portal stone. He's like, what? Wait, why? What do you have against riding? Why do we have to fucking do this? You nearly killed us once, because Matt was one of the people who was literally crying after their trip to Toman Head, and who knows how much Matt actually remembers of that, but he remembers enough to know that it was fucking awful, and he's not looking to do it again. So it says, "Do we have to do it this way?" Matt said, "What do you have against riding?" Rand only looked at him, and he shrugged uncomfortably. "Oh, burn me, if you're trying to decide." Because Rourke has pointed out on the portal stone 2 symbols for Rhoydian, so they're trying to decide which one will be the one to use to get there. Taking both horses' reins in one hand, he dug a coin from his pocket, a gold Tarvalin mark, and sighed. It would be the same coin, wouldn't it? He rolled the coin across the backs of his fingers. "I'm lucky sometimes, Rand. Let my luck choose. Head the one that points to your right, flame the other. What do you say?" "This is the most ridiculous," Egwene began, but Moraine silenced her with a touch on the arm. Rand nodded. "Why not?" Egwene muttered something. All he caught were men and boys, but it did not sound a compliment. The coin spun into the air off Matt's thumb, gleaming dully in the sun. At its peak, Matt snatched it back and slapped it down on the back of his other hand, then hesitated. "It's a bloody thing to be trusting to the toss of a coin, Rand." Rand laid his palm on one of the symbols without looking. "This one," he said. "You chose this one." Matt peeked at the coin and blinked. "You're right." So Matt has these little moments of guiding and aiding his own fate. Some of them are impulsive, like his choice to go through the second doorway while he's killing time waiting for Rand to come out of the glass columns, and then he has others that take pure grit and determination. It takes serious guts for him to ask to go into Rhoydian, because that is not something that would have happened if he had not been willing to open his mouth in violation of custom and determinedly ask permission, which isn't something that you do. People who are not Aiel don't go to Rhoydian, and it's not something he wants to do. Rand receives permission. The 4 wise ones are like, yeah, you can go to Rhoydian. And it says, Matt scrambled up to copy Rand's bow awkwardly. "I also asked to enter Rhoydian," he said shakily. The 4 wise ones stared at him. Rand's head whipped around in surprise. And a little further on it says, "The wise ones exchanged glances. Troubled glances," Egwene would have said, though they were almost as good as Aes Sedai at keeping their faces blank when they wanted to. "It is not permitted," Amy said finally. "Young man, you do not know what you have done. Go back with the others." Her eyes brushed across Egwene and Moraine and Lon, standing alone now with the horses near the wind-scoured portal stone. Egwene could not find any recognition for her in that glance. "I can't." Matt sounded desperate. "I've come this far, but this doesn't count, does it? I have to go to Rhoydian." "It is not permitted," Melaine said sharply, her long red-gold hair swinging as she shook her head. "You have no Aiel blood in your veins." Rand had been studying Matt all this time. "He comes with me," he said suddenly. "You gave me permission, and he can come with me whether you say he can or not." He stared back at the wise ones, not defiantly, merely determined, set in his mind. Egwene knew him like this. He would not back down, whatever they said. So that took a lot of guts. And it's not like he really wants to accompany Rand, but at this point, if the threat of fate is set, he's riding out of the stone and he learns, oh, we're going to Rodian, and then it's like, oh, we're going this very, very day, less than 12 hours after he's told you need to go to Rodian, they're right outside the city, and he's like, okay, I've come this far, but it's not going to be enough. How am I going to find out this fate that I am now obsessed with if I don't actually go into the city? And we're not getting a tortured internal narrative post-doorway of him furiously brooding over everything, because we've gotten enough to know that he's anxious, he's upset, he's feeling paralyzed, and his emotions are hair-trigger. So to get him to the point where he's actually going to open his mouth and ask, hey, yo, can I go into your city? We can assume his anxiety has ratcheted up, his turmoil has ratcheted up, the thoughts are just going on, and he's berating himself, blaming Moraine, blaming Rand, blaming fate, telling himself he's stupid to still be here, anything but accept the fact that, yeah, I'm Ta'Veren and this is my path. So we don't need to see any more of that, because it's only interesting to a certain point where it's amusing, and then after that you just want to smother someone. So Matt accompanies Rand, and we learn at the fog wall that Matt has a certain hope that maybe the snakes weren't lying, but actually that they're like fair fortune tellers or something, that they have rote answers that they tell people. It says, Rand, maybe that's the answer they give everybody, those snake people, I mean. Go to Rodian. Maybe we don't have to be here at all. He did not believe it, but with that fog staring him in the face, Rand turned his head to look at him, not speaking. Finally he said, they never mentioned Rodian to me, Matt. Oh, burn me, he muttered. Somehow or other he meant to find a way back through that twisted doorway and Tyr. Absently he pulled the gold Tarvalin mark from his coat pocket, rolled it across the backs of his fingers and thrust it back. Those snaky folk were going to give him a few more answers whether they wanted to or not, somehow. Without another word, Rand rose and started toward the fog in an unsteady stride, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Matt hurried after him. Burn me. Burn me. I do not want to do this. Matt doesn't know what he's supposed to do when he's in there. He's wondering if he has to follow Rand into the glass columns, and Rand's like, no, I think you go in there and you're an Aiel clan chief or you die. Do not follow me in there no matter what. And Matt's finally like, okay, if you don't want me to come, I won't come. It says, peering at the city, he wondered what he was doing there. Those people had said he would die otherwise, but was just being in Rodian enough? Do I have to do something? What? And the answer to that question is he just has to be Matt Cawthon, and the rest of it will take care of itself. So he calls after Rand as Rand disappears into the glass array. It says, you look out what you're bloody doing, he shouted. You leave me alone in the waste with Moraine and the bloody Aiel, and I'll strangle you, Dragon Reborn or no. After a minute he added, I'm not coming in there after you if you get yourself in trouble. You hear me? There was no answer, if he's not out of there in an hour. He's mad just going in there, he muttered. Well, I'll not be the one to pull his bacon off the coals. He's the one who can channel. If he's put his head in a hornet's nest, he can bloody channel his way out of it. I'll give him an hour. And then he would leave, whether Rand was back or not. Just turn around and leave. Just go. That was what he would do. He would. The way those thin shafts of glass caught the bluish light, refracting and reflecting, merely looking too hard was enough to give him a headache. He turned away, wandering back the way he had come, uneasily eyeing the ter'angreal, or whatever they were, filling the plaza. What was he doing there? Why? Suddenly he stopped dead, staring at one of those strange objects, a large door frame of polished redstone, twisted in some way he could not quite catch, so his eye seemed to slip, trying to follow it around. Slowly he made his way to it, between glittering faceted spires as tall as his head, and low golden frames filled with what appeared to be sheets of glass, barely noticing them, never taking his eyes off the doorway. It was the same polished redstone, the same size, the same eye-wrenching corners. Along each upright ran 3 lines of triangles, points down. Had the one in Tyr had those? He could not remember. He had not been trying to remember all the details last time. It was the same. It had to be. And here Matt is in over his head, because he knew the rules of the first doorway. Moraine told Egwene, and she passed them on to him. Don't ask any questions about the shadow. Don't ask any frivolous or stupid questions. He knew those rules. Here there are no Aes Sedai to tell him the rules. No one to advise him on how to negotiate the price. No one to be like, hey, before you ask them for anything, you have to be like, here's what I am going to pay for the things I'm going to ask for. No one to tell him what it actually does. And because he just bowls in there, not knowing the actual purpose of the ter'angreal, and he's all fucking stupid in the way he tells them what he wants, they're like, sure, okay, but now you're going to pay for it. And so because they're dicks, they kill him for it. I think that Matt is the most interesting of the three ta'veren because he's unique. The talents of Perrin and Rand are much more organic and much simpler, like a Beastmaster and a Mage/Chosen One. But Matt, his power involves knowledge and luck and artifacts, and these things that are his powers wouldn't even work as well if Matt just weren't Matt. He'd never have acquired them if Matt weren't Matt. Everything that makes him special beyond being tied to the pattern itself is a result of his recklessness and impulsiveness and general Mattness. And here he's in a situation that's kind of like the story The Monkey's Paw, where they wish they get their dead loved one back, and they don't specify they want it back alive, so they get a zombie back or something. Matt never specified when he wanted the holes in his memory filled that the memories actually be his, and because he didn't specify, it's not just that he got hosed because he didn't set the price ahead of time and so they killed him for it. He got hosed because he wasn't specific enough, because he didn't think things through carefully. He knew to think things through carefully ahead of time for the first one, and he knew that he was going to have to ask questions very specifically, and he even asked the questions of the foxes very specifically, not knowing that they didn't answer questions. And the vagueness of his wishes screws him because he's just yelling about the things that he wants because he's frustrated now. I wish I had this and this and this because I'm fucking frustrated and I'm yelling at you guys because you aren't answering questions, not knowing, oh, these aren't the question demon creatures, these are the wish demon creatures, but make the right wishes. So our next Matt POV is 17 days later, which is 10 days out from Rhuidean. He and Rand are in there for 7 days, even though it doesn't seem like more than a day. It's after the peddlers show up, so you have Kadir and Isandra, and then Keely and Jason Natale, aka Lanfear and Asmodean. RJ is doing some great world building as we see through Matt's eyes the Aiel doing their trading with the merchants and seeing the kinds of stuff that they buy. And it's captivating to hear Matt's mental commentary on that, particularly because Matt is a character who looks at commerce. That's kind of his thing. Rand looks at crops and farming, Perrin looks at construction and craftsmanship, and Matt looks at trading and commerce. And that's something with POV that RJ pays really close attention to that's just so fucking cool. And one of the things that I think makes him such a talented writer when it comes to point of view. But it says here, one driver kept trying to interest the Aiel in a heavy gold-worked crossbow with no success. The crossbow caught Matt's eye, all those inlaid gold lions with what seemed to be rubies for eyes. Small, but still rubies. Of course, a good Two Rivers longbow could shoot 6 arrows while a crossbowman was still cranking back the bowstring for his second shot. A longer range for a crossbow that size, though, by 100 paces, with 2 men doing nothing but keeping a crossbow with bolt in place in the hands of each crossbowman, and stout pikemen to hold the cavalry off. Wincing, Matt let his head fall back against the spokes. It had happened again. He had to get out of the waste, away from more rain, away from any Aes Sedai. Maybe back home for a while. Maybe he could get there in time to help with this White Cloak trouble. Small chance of that unless I use the bloody ways or another bloody portal stone. That would not solve his problems anyway. For one thing, there were no answers in Emond's Field to what those snaky folk had meant about marrying the daughter of the 9 moons, or dying and living again, or Rhuidean. Through his coat he rubbed the silver fox-head medallion, hung around his neck again. The pupil of the fox's eye was a tiny circle split by a sinuous line, one side polished bright, the other shaded in some way, the ancient symbol of Aes Sedai before the breaking. The black-hafted spear, sword-blade point marked with 2 ravens, he took from where it was leaning beside him and laid it across his knees. More Aes Sedai work. Rhuidean had provided no answers, only more questions, and before Rhuidean his memory had been full of holes. Casting back in his mind then he would be able to remember walking up to a door in the morning and leaving in the evening, but nothing between. Now there was something in between, filling all those holes, waking dreams, or something very like. It was as if he could remember dances and battles and streets and cities, none of which he had ever really seen, none of which he was sure had ever existed, like 100 pieces of memory from 100 different men. Better to think of them as dreams, maybe, a little better, yet he was as sure in them as in any of his own remembrances. Battles numbered the most, and sometimes they crept up on him in a way as with the crossbow. he would find himself looking at a piece of ground and plan how to set an ambush there, or defend against one, or how to set an army for battle. It was madness. Without looking, he traced the flowing script carved into the black spear shaft. He could read it as easily as any book now, though it had taken him the whole trip back to Chaindair to realize it. Rand had not said anything, but he suspected he had given himself away there in Roydian. He knew the old tongue now, sifted whole out of those dreams. Light, what did they do to me? And Matt is, of course, blaming other people again. What did they do to me? Just as when he has his lucky night in Tar Valon, and he's thinking about how his luck came after the Shatter Logoth dagger. He's like, what did the Aes Sedai do to me? Never, what are the consequences of the actions that I've taken? How have my fuck-ups led me to this point? And whether or not Matt gets to the point of being able to own his fuck-ups is something that I don't actually know, and I'm going to have to pay attention to as I read on and do the podcast, because to my recollection it doesn't seem like he does, but he takes responsibility for so many other things, and in so many other ways, so maybe he does get to that point finally, and I'll have to keep an eye out. A little bit later on, Asmodean, who is posing as a gleeman, gets asked to play a song. And the song he plays is Midian's Ford, a glorified story of Manetheren of an ancient battle that Matt actually remembers, though it ends a lot more sadly in real life than it does in the song. And it says, his last memory at the ford was trying to keep his feet waist deep in the river with 3 arrows in him, but there was something later, a fragment, seeing Edaman, grey-bearded now, go down in a sharp fight in a forest, toppling from his rearing horse, the spear in his back put there by an unarmored, beardless boy. This was worse than the holes had been. So RJ just delights us throughout the rest of the series with little bits and pieces of Matt having these memories, which are useful for a number of purposes. They're useful because they torment Matt and stoke his internal melodrama, and that's always fun, because Matt is a character with a generally positive attitude, so usually his pain is presented in a melodramatic fashion. But it's also true that this situation is genuinely painful and would be absolutely distressing, and it makes Matt really interesting because it causes a unique inner struggle. These memories also allow for rich and layered world building. They give us history through observation rather than exposition from the eyes of someone who has seen a large swath of time, and they do a great job of showing RJ's understanding of military history, which he uses to make Matt a far more interesting general than just about any fictional general I've ever heard of. He's got way more than the 10,000 hours required to be an expert. He's able to learn from fatal mistakes that he's made. He's extra, and I love Matt and his complexities as a character, the things that make him so different from everybody else. He is one of a kind, and kind of amazing. And I think as far as Matt having his holes in his memory filled with bits of other men's memories and it being worse than having the holes, I think it probably is in a lot of ways. The Foxes gave him important tools. They gave him tools that are useful for defense and protection and strategy. But he is also, because of this, forcefully evolved and fundamentally changed. He has had his way back for what is, and what he is now is an uncommonly lucky guy with useful knowledge, a ter'angreal that protects him from Aes Sedai, and a power-wrought weapon that he has the use of because he used it so much in his memories, so while he was a reasonably decent fighter before, now he's OP. And I always wondered what the deal was with his spear, so seeing after he rescues Moraine that actually its purpose was to be a key was really cool. I loved getting that tie-in. So, Matt has gone through the doorways and come back with artifacts and a head full of other men's memories, still tied to the dragon. In fact, it's safe to say he's probably tied more tightly than he was before he went in. And in the next book, he goes through a much more metaphorical doorway, because he thinks he's finally getting away. He's managed to pack his stuff and leave, and he feels no Teviran tugging as he's trying to slip away before the Battle of Cairhien. And instead he ends up swept up in the largest Teviran swirling of all, a swirling all his own, because what will be is the band. And once he is attached to the band, he can't get away from them, because the men attached to him, and they're like, "You're our battle leader now." And after that he can't get shut of them. The band is his future, and instead of having the final chalice poured over him and having him be accepted and accepting of his fate, Rand has to browbeat Matt through the final bit, where he basically corners him for hours, pummeling him and being like, it's time to stop running. You have to accept it. I need you to go to Tyr and take over this army that I'm building up, because Samael needs to take it seriously. I need to have someone there so he knows that it's a real hammer, even though it's a fake hammer. And Matt finally gives in, but he's so upset he goes back to his room and flings his spear, and then his Aiel girlfriend tops off his evening by trying to kill him. But the wheel puts Matt through the ringer because he wants to be selfish, and I enjoy his melodrama and his pain. For some reason, there's strangely a fundamental positivity in someone not wanting to accept an outcome that sucks, while at the same time, eventually you have to live in reality. And so I love watching Matt get pushed through to the place where ultimately he's going to have to accept. Because once he stops fighting and has a bit more control over his life, I enjoy his internal melodrama even more, because it's easier to sympathize with the hardships of his fate once he stops being such a douche about it. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Podcast of the Dragon. I appreciate everybody's patience while I got this one out. I've had a lot going on. The month of January was packed. I'm not going to be able to promise regularly scheduled content for the time being, just that I'll steadily plug away with the hopes of having no more than 3 weeks between episodes. That's my goal. This episode's accompanying minisode on Patreon is an examination of the scene that goes down on Chaindare where Matt asks to enter Roydian. If you'd like to support the show and have access to that or other fun content, there's a link in the show notes. There are other links as well to Discord, my email, the Watt Trivia and Games Discord, and the Watt Fandom and Calendar Discord. There is a link to my YouTube channel as well. You should go and subscribe, as well as to my Twitter handle, @PodOfTheDragon. There's also a link to Apple Podcasts. If you could review my show, I'd appreciate it. It will help other people find me, and so will word of mouth. So if you know anybody who likes The Wheel of Time and might be interested in a different kind of podcast, please tell them about me. My music is by Kevin MacLeod. My name is Morgan, and I wouldn't have had Matt's problem of asking the wrong questions and making accidental wishes, because when I get agitated and frustrated, I melt down into tears and can't say anything. That would probably be the one time in my life that I'd actually be grateful for it, because normally it kinda sucks.